Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a four-part lecture series on the origins of Catholic social thought. I invite you to listen to all four parts and feel free to share with others and leave comments in the comments section below. Catholic social thought begins with the document Rerum Novarum on New Things by Leo XIII, published in 1891. It begins with the statement that the spirit of revolutionary change, which has long disturbed the nations of the world, has passed from politics to economic life. The purpose of this four-part series is to understand Rerum Novarum's contribution in light of the revolutionary change which has struck the world. And again, we're talking about revolutionary change as seen from the perspective of 1891 and the perspective of a pope living in Rome. So the four-part series begins with the historical roots. Part one is the events, and part two are the theoretical changes that we might talk about historically that lead up to the need for a document like Rerum Novarum. Part three will be a discussion of the main points of Rerum Novarum and looking at the three primary principles of Catholic social thought. And part four will be a discussion of the legacy of Rerum Novarum. So we want to begin then with the historical roots and events of the document. We begin with church dominance. The Roman Catholic Church reached its height, theoretically at least, if not in terms of power, in the 12 and 1300s AD. And here we pick these time periods because we see this Catholic synthesis reflected in two major works of the Catholic intellectual tradition. The first is the Summa Theologica, written by St. Thomas Aquinas. It was written between the years of 1265 and 1274. St. Thomas lived from 1225 to 1274. So the Summa Theologica was not actually finished. It was also not published during his lifetime. It received publication in 1485. And here we have a synthesis in two senses. The first synthesis is this document that contains the whole of the Catholic intellectual thought at the time. And so it brings together all these different pieces of knowledge that we could talk about at the time. So we would talk about science and philosophy and theology all put into this document in a way that relates it all together. The second is Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a narrative poem that also represents this Catholic synthesis of what the world looks like. Now, the Divine Comedy is of course, imaginative in many ways, but it is influenced by this intellectual tradition within the Roman Catholic tradition, and certainly would be influenced by the same sort of things that Thomas Aquinas would have been influenced by. So this represents this sort of synthesis in church power in the 12 and 1300s. And what we're going to see is this gradual decline of power and then a rejection by the church hierarchy of the modern world and all these changes, which leads to the need for a document like Rerum Novarum. Even at the time, of course, there were challenges to church authority, and we want to put those in context as well. The investiture controversy from 1070 to 1122 would constitute one of the greatest challenges, and this was between primarily Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. And the issue was who gets to name the bishop or other religious leader in a territory. And traditionally, this would have been done by the emperor or king at the time. And Pope Gregory wants to push back against that and say that only the Pope has the right to name who the bishop is. This led to a variety of military movements, and Henry IV being excommunicated, which put his own rule in jeopardy, and then threats to Pope Gregory's life. It finally resolved with the Concordat of Worms, in which it was decided that the Pope would choose, but the bishops were fealty to the emperor. So even at this time, politics and church were intermingled, and the seat of power could be highly contested. And that's certainly part of what's going on here. There's also, of course, struggle for territory over this time period. So the gradual growth and lessening of the Papal States, as well as other Catholic-identified territories. We also have the Great Schism, which happens towards the end of this Great Synthesis. And the Great Schism refers to there being dual popes for a while, and at one time 3 popes, all claiming allegiance and from different military factions, state territories. This was resolved with the Council of Constance, which finally chose one pope to lead the Catholic Church. And then we also have the warrior pope, Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513. And under his leadership, he used war to extend the papal states to their greatest extent ever. And after his papacy, the papal states went into decline and lessened for centuries. We also want to think about other challenges to church authority. And here we're thinking about the roots of Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and other Protestant movements. So we're putting this under the historical events category because the rise of Lutheranism and Anglicanism are historical events, even though we're going to bring in some of the theory here. What you have during this Catholic synthesis is really a contrasting themes between the optimism of the Franciscans and the Thomists and the pessimism of the Augustinian tradition. So St. Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas saw human beings as basically good, though in need of salvation, whereas St. Augustine saw human beings as basically bad or evil and only relying on the will of God to save them. We also see the rise of Christian humanism during this time period. And here was the attempt to take the scriptures and read them historically and put them into their historical context. So there would be much more interest in reading about the history during the time of which the scriptures were written and try to understand the language and the ideas and the images of the scriptures in their historical context. Another challenge, though, to the synthesis is German mysticism. And this mysticism was Catholic. It was an attempt to relate to God through mystical experience, but it also required a private relation to God. And so there was a move away from, in some sense, the Christian community to this private relation to God. So these 3 theoretical possibilities lead to Luther and his break from the Catholic Church and Lutheranism as a contesting religion. Lutheranism adopts the Augustinian pessimism, rejects some of the historical reading of the scriptures, but in fact embraces this private relation to God. And so part of what underwrites Lutheranism is this doctrine of salvation, that only faith alone can win salvation, and works will have no effect there. Anglicanism arises later, so Luther is from 1483 to 1546. He was originally Augustinian and developed this new approach in his lifetime. Anglicanism arose with the debate between Henry VIII in England and the Roman Catholic Church over the legitimacy of divorce. He finally broke away from the Catholic Church in 1534 when it refused to give him a divorce. This led to the martyrdom of St. Thomas More, who was a religious cleric under Henry VIII and who refused to defend Henry VIII against the Roman Catholic Church, and so he sacrificed his life there. Anglicanism adopts some of the Augustinian pessimism, but it's much more about political power than Lutheranism was. In the religious wars that follow both Lutheranism and Anglicanism, it's much more, or as much, about political power and the contest of who has legitimate authority in political territory, as it is about different claims to faith. But what we see here, of course, is a lessening of church power and church influence. We also have cultural changes that we'll talk a little bit more about. So we have the rise of modern science, particularly with Francis Bacon in 1561 to 1626, who claims that knowledge is power. And so here he's talking about power in the sense of taking control of the world and dominating the world. And so he calls for a great instauration, by which he means that all knowledge must be rewritten and all the sciences reconstructed. So you have in the 1200s with Thomas Aquinas this total construction of knowledge, and science with Francis Bacon comes along and says we must do away with all of this and begin knowledge anew. Of course, he's not the only one that does this, but he is one of the more influential people that calls for this revisioning of what knowledge is. The Renaissance, of course, happens in the 16th and 17th century when we go back to these historical events and look at different texts in their historical light, trying to recapture the Greek and Roman literature and art, and to understand what it was like to engage in literature art in those time periods, and then to bring those forward to our own time periods. And finally, we had the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1840, that has a significant impact on life in the world and can certainly be understood as one of the revolutions that Leo XIII is talking about when he begins Rerum Novarum. And here we have a new way of doing life. And in the Industrial Revolution, we have the destruction of common communities, common goods, and common ways of life, replaced by individual ways of life in the cities, and an attention away from farming communities to living in the cities. And finally, we want to keep in mind, of course, the political revolutions that will be central to the Pope's mind as he writes Rerum Novarum. Of course, we've already mentioned the loss of political power and land, but we can also talk about various revolutions that are going to be at the heart of his thinking. So the American and French revolutions, which through various means bring about democracy into the world. And so this emphasis on the freedom of the individual. There are revolts against the Spanish crown, Spain being one of the primary Catholic countries. And other revolts that we can talk about, as well as famine in Ireland, which was a significantly Catholic country. And in 1848, 40 years before the Pope writes, the revolutions throughout Europe inspired by, are taking root from industrial change. So that's a history of the dominance of the Catholic